Okay, in the previous video I looked at youth transitions, and now I'm going to look at one of the other aspects of youth studies, which is youth transitions. Where youth culture looks at the kind of more leisure practices and creative and consumption practices and related to pop culture and everyday life. Youth transitions looks, I suppose, at the more official social parts of being a young person. In this sense, it's more about kind of that liminal period between a child and adult. Now, youth culture is about that as well, but like the notion of transition here relates to that kind of growing up stage. So there's been kind of three main areas of where this has been done, but again, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's there are these three main areas that are good ways to thinking about this. There's school to work transitions, which is going to school and then getting a job, and how those may be prolonged, and whether you go to higher education or not, and how useful school is for getting a job. There's domestic transitions, which is meeting a partner and having a relationship, maybe starting a family or whatever. And then there's housing transitions, and that's essentially moving out of the family home and finding your own place to live. Now you can see, I'm sure you're thinking already how complex some of those things are. What's been interesting about the 30 or so years of youth studies research is that it's kind of almost challenging its own object, to the sense that many of those markers of being an adult, getting a full-time job, buying and having a mortgage and having your own house, settling down and getting married and having kids, all those kind of normative things are happening later and later in life, if happening at all. So this kind of notion of youth then really kind of needs to be rethought, and so then does the very idea of being an adult, because many of those traditional markers of an adult are happening later and later in life. So, in the previous, back in some kind of ideal type of previous generations, young person would complete their education, get a job or maybe go to higher education, start living independently, move out of home, get their own place, find a partner, set up a house, have kids. And this kind of happened, mostly in the early 20s. That was a kind of normative story of that. Really that linear transition today isn't really the norm anymore. It may be overestimated how much it was the norm in the past as well. Maybe it was the norm for relatively privileged people, but not so much the norm for everybody. But it certainly just doesn't really describe that pattern now of moving from a child to an adult. So rather being a linear transition, these direct routes from school to work and that kind of thing, the language around it now, it's kind of blurry, delayed, zigzagged. You take one step forward, one step back. It's happening later and later in life. So this is the kind of idea of the extended transition. I can use myself as an example here. I've got a long-term partner and I have a mortgage, but I'm not married. We're not having kids. I had a full-time job for the first time since the early 90s in 2009. All these different kind of markers of being adulthood have kind of been very linear for me, and I'm kind of a Generation X person. The research about the complexity and the extended transitions of this kind of started around people like me that kind of went through these processes in the 90s. That's when it was a kind of rapid period of social change, and it's kind of almost the norm now for young people. It's not really considered to be, a new thing as much anymore, these extended transitions. Now, why has this happened? Why is these increased, prolonged, decoupled transitions between education and work, dating and mating, and childhood and adulthood? Well, there's been a bunch of social and economic structural changes. There's a widening participation in higher education, which has been great. It means, in many ways, people from more disadvantaged background can move into higher ed. But this has also seen what's called the upward credentialising of the labour market, where more and more job positions need more and more credentials, so people stay in education longer, and therefore, getting that full-time job is happening, later. There's things like increased life expectancy, birth control. People are getting married later and having kids later. Now, many of this relates to kind of feminist progressions that have seen more and more women come into the labour market, which is in many ways a kind of positive development. But then it kind of sees, women, as we've discussed in the week on sex, gender, and sexuality, expected to kind of be the superwoman to both, have the kids, look after the household, and have the career. And again, this means that there's decisions made of things like getting married and having kids later on. Of course, relates to careers, relates to finding the right partner. And there's even kind of responsibility decisions here about making sure one's financially secure to be in the position to kind of have kids and be able to look after them. Other kind of economic changes, certainly rising house prices, the fact now that it costs so much more to buy a house in compared to wages and salaries than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And really one of the key things that I suppose influence all the things we're talking about here is the rise of the precarious labour market. The fact that there's fewer and fewer full-time secure positions, more and more short-term casualised contract work means people are in, precarious, stressful, anxious positions, and really increasingly it needs 10, 15 years worth of kind of, episodic work to be able to get up the resume, to be able to enter and get, the increasingly fewer and fewer full-time jobs. So in many respects, young people are entering the full-time labour force much later than ever before, are living with parents for longer if they're lucky enough to have that kind of family support, and marrying and having kids much later. So these, as I said, are extending the transition. So there's a link there to a report. It's a few years old now, but kind of shows the stats of many of the things I've been talking about. We're seeing increased ages of first marriage, increased age of the first child, increased ages of leaving the home, increasing rates of young people in higher ed, increasing women in the workforce, certainly the massive increase of part-time work, and decreasing rates of identified organised religion, decreasing full-time work, which relates to kind of notions of detraditionalisation that we looked at early in the course, and that I'll talk about in the next part of the lecture. So there's a link there to some stats that kind of highlight some of the things I've been talking about. So why have these changes occurred? Well, rates in full-time employment have been decreasing since World War II. The labour market restructures, transition to this post-industrial society that we've been talking about throughout the course. Certainly governments have shifted to the right when it comes to labour market provisions, moved from kind of social democratic regimes of the 1970s and, talk about having full employment through to kind of governments now that seem to want to restructure the labour market, kind of antithetical to unions and collective bargaining, sees the worker more individualised in the labour market and having to face all of these risks themselves. So you can see some changes there, like, simple stats like, the two-thirds to one-third drop in full-time employment from 1988 to 1998. Certainly ever-increasing amounts of young people coming to secondary education. That's not just higher ed, it's also the private education sector and TAFE. And also really importantly here is the rise and acceptance of the so-called McJob. It's only been the past, decades, this hasn't been a kind of thing that's, been part of capitalism the whole time, that young people get paid less than adults, the kind of so-called McJob. It's kind of legislated discrimination in a way. Why should young people working get paid less than older people? So there's this kind of discrimination in the way that people are paid for the first place, but also this kind of now idea that young people, as teenagers at school and then even in their early 20s should have these kind of insecure, often so-called unskilled jobs that don't have a lot of status as a way of kind of learning how to be a worker and learning discipline and all these kind of things. So again, this sees people entering the full-time labour market or even having the ability to do that happening later and later. It certainly has real effects on young people's ability to be financially independent. So that's been looking at the kind of transitions point of view. You can see here that there's been these two traditions. And it's really important today, I think, to not think about them and be as completely separate. Now, the youth transitions tradition and the youth cultures traditions, it comes around, I suppose, because you can't really do research on a young person's full life. You need to kind of do research, on, particular problems, whether that's they can't get a job, or, unemployment or poverty or homelessness, or when it comes to youth cultures, the way that young people are expressing their politics through, various activities or whatever. So from those kind of different interests, they kind of develop these two different, I suppose, fields. But really, as they were kind of separate endeavours, it really kind of gave this distorted view of young people's lives. So where youth transitions tended to focus on work, education, opportunities, sometimes deviance, particularly when it was institutional, youth culture tended to focus on, more cultural study stuff, subcultures, consumption, music, fashion. So it's only recently that I suppose those traditions are starting to come back together, and research tends to have a more holistic view of these things, to combine the two and realise that transitions are embedded in cultural practices as much as, social practices. And certainly the kind of realisation that young people often invest themselves in various youth cultures as a way of kind of shielding and, relaxing themselves from all the pressures in the youth transition side of things. So in many ways, transition studies needs to be more culturally rich, while youth culture studies need to be more aware of the kind of spatial, contours of inequality and stuff like that happen in young people's lives. So that's been, two very quick summaries, youth transitions and youth cultures. What I'm going to do in the last part of the lecture is relate some of the things I've been talking about to the concepts that we've been looking at in the course so far.